Haidong! So in this video we're going to talk about 5 common mistakes in Gumdo. I'm avoiding using the phrase like, oh, here are the top 5 things. It's not meant to be something as click-baity as that. It's intended just to be like, all right, well, here are 5 things I've noticed with a lot of students, right? So not just my students, but like as I've been watching people throughout the East Coast. So these are 5 things I noticed that are probably the most common that I've seen, which all have pretty similar underlying issues. But these are all symptoms that you can look for, and if you notice it yourself doing it or your students doing it, I'm also going to tell you like, okay, why are they doing it, and hopefully this will help fix that. So the biggest thing that I see is especially in Chianse. So Chianse is usually here, right? I'm going to step back just so you can really see my feet. But what I tend to see is this guy, right? You're going to notice that the back heel is really high up. Whoop, I'm already off balance. Now this is something that I see very common in other sword martial arts as well, so especially Kendo, because again, that's very different, right? So Kendos intend to go mostly linear. Gumdo, we're supposed to go in all directions, right? But if you do this, you're kind of dedicating to, first of all, one direction, and also it's just not good. It's not good for a few reasons, right? So first of all, I've always mentioned that, like, all right, you want to use your bigger muscle groups in order to move around. If you do this, your muscle groups are completely slack. There's nothing keeping it together. So one way, first of all, you can fix this is activate that back glute. So right now it's soft. So as I activate it, it's going to subtly shift down, right? Another thing to think about is if you do have that back glute activated, that means I can move in most directions that I need to, as opposed to if I'm here, I'm going to be like, right? It's not going to be as effective. So first of all, so just from an aesthetic point of view, it looks kind of bad, right? Because it's like, oh, like I'm not, so also as you do this, you also tend to lean back a little bit as well. So first of all, it's going to be bad for your lower back, it's going to be bad for your, first of all, your foot. In general, this is not going to lead to long-term benefits, right? So if anything, this is going to hurt you so much more than just like taking, I mean, it might take like a month or two, maybe even more, just focusing on this one thing to fix it. But once you do, it's going to be a lot more effective because you'll be able to move around a lot more effectively. You're going to damage your body a lot less because try it, right? So if you're here and you try to move, where do you feel the strain? You're going to feel strain mostly in the knee, which if you're someone who has half the cartilage in their knee, not great. Again, that was really specific. But if you have some knee issues, right, that's going to really hurt, right? And especially if I'm going to try to move offline, right? So I'm not moving straight forward, I'm moving like maybe to the side. That's going to compound the pain and the difficulty in that back foot. So if there's nothing else in this video and you still notice yourself doing that, that's the very first thing I would like you to focus on. Because again, from the aesthetic point of view, it looks weird. From a kinesiological point of view, it's bad for your body, right? Because again, you're putting more emphasis on smaller muscles as opposed to bigger muscles. And also it's just gonna make you not as competent in sword fighting, right? So if I'm facing you, and I see your back, like you're doing that, that leg thing, so that heel up, I know you're going for me straight on. Like you might be able to do like a kind of thing, but you're gonna hurt yourself so much more quickly that I'm not particularly worried about it. Versus if you're again more settled here and you're more controlled. So first of all, notice that immediately I feel a lot more, well, you won't know that, but immediately I feel like I have a lot more control this way, right? So I can kind of feel myself opening up a little bit more. Again, this is more dignified as well. Here, so I can also move if I need to. I can also switch feet if I need to a lot more quickly. As opposed to this, if I switch my feet, it's very obvious what I'm going to do. So I could rant about that for a full hour. So I'm going to keep it there. And if you have any questions, let me know. The next most common thing is what I'm going to call the turtleneck cut. This is something that, so first I'll just show you what it looks like. Hopefully you can see it sufficiently. Here, I'm going to, again, try to replicate it. So you notice how my head kind of like shifts forward as I do my cut. So first of all, it's very noticeable once you kind of have an eye for it. So comparing these two, right? So 1 versus 2. Very obvious, right? So you might be thinking like, all right, like, is the first just you're putting more emphasis on it? It's like, no. So let's talk about like what is generating that turtleneck cut. So the cut in itself may not be bad, right? You can still cut someone with a turtleneck cut, but the underlying cause for it is a little bit of a concern. So I mentioned the underlying cause for the kendo foot, unfortunately is what I've been calling it to my students. So sorry, kendo people, because I know there's maybe like 5 of you out there watching. But this is something I see the most common in kendo, so that's why I'm calling it that. So the underlying cause for that was using a bigger muscle group and fix that, right? So again, the fix for that was activating your left glute, so actually like you have some solid background, right? So you might be like, all right, you like to work with themes, there's probably a theme behind this, so you're not using the correct muscle group or something. Yes, right? So if you're focusing on this, right? So first of all, if you are doing the turtleneck cut, that means you're using almost exclusively the right arm. So notice I'm not saying the right shoulder, like deep shoulder. You're using your right arm. So that's going to be, I won't call it wrong. That's going to be troublesome for at least 2 reasons. So for one, you're using, again, smaller muscle groups. That was a common theme, right? Because if you're just using your arm, you're going to get tired a lot more quickly. It's not going to be as powerful either. But also, the other adjective was right. So if you're using a 2-handed sword, you want most of the power in your left hand. Again, mostly because you're going to get a little bit more leverage with the left hand here, get a lot more acceleration with the cut. So the first thing I'd recommend is shift the weight from, or shift the focus from your right to your left hand. It's going to do something, right? So you still might do a little bit of a turtleneck, and then once you kind of shift it back to center or more to the left, again, the focus on the left hand. From there, I want you to focus on using your deep shoulder. Again, how can you do that? So one way you can think about that is think about almost like pressing, I guess like almost like a thumb or like pressure underneath your shoulder and pushing it up this way. I know it's going to look really weird. To over-exaggerate, I'm going to push up, so you see like how that's pumping up, down, up, down, up, down. Now obviously that's going to mellow out a little bit. That's going to help you engage the deep shoulder a lot more. Again, when I say deep shoulder, it's not top shoulder, it's going to be deep inside your scapula, right? So if you're engaged more of that, notice there's going to be a lot less of that turtleneck cut. So once again, it's more dignified, it's more powerful, and it's more universal. So 3 good things that we'd like to hear. So number 3, so let's talk about using your elbows. Now that might seem a little bit like, that does not sound like that's going to be fixed with using a different muscle group. What's going on, right? So if we're here, now this is a little more justifiable because in the past, probably when you first learned how to do center cut, you were told to be here, tip to tailbone, and then cut. Now keep in mind also, that was meant to be a prototype. That was meant so when you are brand new to your sword and they want you to cut straight, they say, tip the tailbone. So first of all, you know that this is above your head, this is above your head. They're both equal and opposite, and then you cut. Now, that's good for maybe white belts. It's not how I teach my students because I don't want them to sever, their vertebrae, right? Because that's one thing that might happen. But that was originally a prototype, and if you did do that, notice what happens to your elbows. They're kind of like flapping out, right? And when you try to fix it, you kind of do like almost like an undulating thing here, there. So there's nothing overtly wrong about the flapping, although I would definitely fix going all the way back because that is going to damage you in the future. But there's nothing overtly wrong with the flapping, so long as you understand what's going on. So one thing that I tend to see is that you're kind of just doing the flapping because that's kind of what you're told to do. What I would recommend instead is try to keep your elbows almost as close to rib width as possible. because again, that's how your body is naturally going to move. So if we're here, that's as far back as I'm going to need to go. So what is one thing I might talk about? The elbows. So look what happens to the inside of my palms if I try to flesh the elbows out. You notice that it actually gets further away from the actual sword in order for it to come back in this way. So now from a physics point of view, there's going to be a lot of counteracting forces as opposed to everything going in the same direction, right? So instead of me like, all right, I want to cut you in half, everything's going to be on this line. I'm going to push forward and up, and just push forward and down. Pretty straightforward, right? Versus here, I'm going to have forces going out this way, and then I'm going to have forces going in this way as my sword's going forward. I'm going to try to synchronize all of that. It's a lot for your brain and body to think about, right? As opposed to streamlining, right? So streamlining is going to be really, really important as you practice more and more. So what I would recommend is think about, first of all, always having this sealed, having that gap sealed whenever you're doing a cut within this 30-degree range. I guess that would be 60 because it's from this 30 to this 30. But notice it is going to change a little bit as you get further and further, right? So once you start going past 45, you kind of need to have the opening here. That said, if you're doing center cuts of some sort, try your best to have that sealed because that's going to mean you're going to be a lot more efficient in terms of your cut. One way to help with that, so again, think about your elbow distance. Try to think almost like you're pushing with your palm forward as you cut, as opposed to push-pulling. So this is something I talked about before. People didn't like it, but that's fine. Push-pulling. So instead of thinking about that, think about only pushing the blade here. And notice that the elbow is going to stay where they are, right? There's no reason for me to open up this way. Now I will note there's a difference between this and then high guard. High guard is going to be a little bit different because this is going to be meant to walk into a cut. And this is also meant for one-hand strikes and stuff like that, which we're going to talk about in the future because it's one of my favorite sparring guards. But in terms of just streamlining your cut, think about the forces involved, right? So think about pushing the blade forward, up, and then pushing the blade back down, as opposed to pulling the blade in, pushing the bottom, flaring out your elbows, doing weird poses. That's too much for your body to think about. So streamline. So streamlining is going to be the key to everything. Now you probably thought like, oh, you didn't mention muscle groups. Guess one way you can help with that. So if you activate your shoulder muscles so again, deep shoulder, as you cut, there's no need to do this, right? The more you do this, actually you feel less of your deep shoulder and more of your top shoulder. As opposed to if you maintain this, you feel your deep shoulder and your core a lot more. So, a third thing, talking about just simple muscle groups. The fourth thing is going to be cutting angle and when to extend. So this might sound a little bit more complicated than it is. So when you cut, right, the idea of a cut is to dispatch a person in order to cut a person, right? So if I'm trying to cut you, which one looks better? So here or here, right? Again, from the side, it might be a little bit easier to see. So A versus B, right? They might sound pretty much the same, but you might notice one had a much earlier extension than the other. So if I'm trying to cut a target, I don't want to do cuts like that, right? That's as if I'm trying to cut like, I probably shouldn't say a word because that's probably a bad thing. Small targets, I'll just say small targets, as opposed to big targets, right? So your own size target. So in general, when you're doing martial arts, you're fighting people of your own size, maybe a little bit taller, just because you want to work on, being able to get out of that kind of situation. So doing this means you're like cutting their hips or something, as opposed to reaching out, right? So reach out that way. That means they're going to be fully extended by the time you hit the collarbone, which is what you want, right? So this is your target, so you want to be able to be fully extended by the time you hit your target. So in general, think about what you're actually cutting as you do a cut. Now I know that might seem a little bit obvious, but you'll be surprised how often you see people do this, right? So kind of like this rolling cut over the shoulder, as opposed to having your hand all the way above for your cut. So you might be asking, well, how do we fix it? Here's one way. So, first of all, when you're doing a diagonal cut, you always want to make sure your left hand is going to be above or at least at your head level, right? And you also want to be able to look underneath this arm. So it's this arm, as opposed to this. If you can look over your hand, that means you're going to be cutting lower than you want, right? Versus if it's up this way, you know it's definitely going to be cutting at least chest level, which is what we're going to be aiming for. So what does that have to do with muscle groups? The lower cut here is going to be using these smaller muscle groups, as opposed to the big cut is going to be using bigger muscle groups. So common theme. So let's take a look at the last one and see if this theme runs out. This last one I'm cheating a little bit because I did actually have a full video on it before, but synchrony. This is yet another thing that I see, again, very, very, very common. Again, not just in new swordsmen, but people who just don't mentally train with it as much either. So for example, again, I talked about Kiken Tai Ichi in my synchrony video. So the idea is to synchronize your body, your breathing, and your swordsmanship all in one motion. So if I do a bad example here, yeah! That's a little bit weird, right? Versus, yeah! Also weird, versus, yeah! All bad, right? Versus, if I have the body moving at the same time as the cut is going at the same time as I'm exhaling. Yeah! Better. I mean, I say good because, you know, yeah, but it's much better. So learning how to synchronize is going to be a better way to just, first of all, look better, also just be more effective, and as you can probably guess, it has something to do with muscle groups, right? So if you're using your bigger muscle groups, and as you're synchronizing, everything's going to be contracting at the same time, as opposed to like your legs still kind of shifting about as your sword's finishing, as you're exhaling. That's a lot of stuff for your body to work with, as opposed to bang, right? So if you're able to get your body synced up with your sword, with the synced up of your breathing, it's gonna be a lot easier for your body. It'll be easier to engage bigger muscle groups because you can focus on fewer things going on. And in general, you're gonna be more effective. Those are 5 things that are very fixable that I would like to see us as an organization pick up on a little bit more. So that was not quite in the order of most important to fix now versus the least important, but it was mostly like the how common, right? So if you notice yourself doing any of these things, or you notice that your student is doing anything else like that, gently guide your way towards more effective means. Now this is the awkward part where, like, all right, I see maybe a fellow master doing this, and it's like, it may not be your place to say anything. So that kind of makes it a little more of a political game as opposed to just generally wanting people to do better. If you do want to kind of fix that for a fellow instructor, you might make that comment in front of a student who is doing it while that master is present. Because again, the main idea is we want to make this organization better, you know, more dignified, and just so much cooler, right? And if we're able to fix these minor things here and there, we will get much better, right? Because if you do fix this by engaging the core or engaging the glute, you're like, oh, what if I use that glute for other things? Suddenly you're going to be much, much better, right? And it's like, okay, I don't want to do that turtleneck thing because that looks ridiculous. So I'm going to use my left hand a little bit more. I'm going to use my deep shoulder. Oh, that's going to affect how I do my diagonal cuts as well. That's going to affect how I do my uppercuts as well. That's going to affect so many other things. So obviously it's going to be a tender subject if you're not in the position where you're supposed to fix someone else. Obviously if you see your instructor doing it, nope, right? So like, don't say anything, right? Again, same situation, like, all right, so one thing that you can do is if you see someone higher ranking doing it, is ask yourself, am I doing that thing? If I am doing that thing, fix that thing, because that's all you can do. That said, if you're in a position to teach, I highly recommend teaching these 5 things. So with that said, stay safe, stay humble, and keep training. Haidong!